renal physiology, we are following up on just having talked about the cardiovascular system, and renal physiology is intimately tied to the cardiovascular system. Certainly, it's really a challenge to separate any body systems from each other because they are all working together holistically to keep the body working and healthy. But we tend to separate systems just to make it easier to understand them. And certainly, we do the same thing with the urinary system, otherwise known as the renal system. But it's so intimately tied to the cardiovascular system that in my mind, it's hard to separate. Certainly, there's things within the renal system, some functions that aren't as directly related. For example, excretion of waste, maintenance of body pH. But a huge part of it is maintaining blood volume, and the corollary to that is maintaining blood pressure. So we'll take a look at all the different functions of the renal system, but it's important to understand some underlying anatomy to really get a grasp on what's going on physiologically. So if we look here, this is a frontal or coronal section of the abdominal region and the retroperitoneal region. Don't worry about those terms. But here and here are the kidneys, right and left kidney. Sitting on top of these, just for reference, are the adrenal glands, not part of the renal system per se, just physically attached to the kidneys. So we have two kidneys, and right here is the urinary bladder. So urine is produced in the kidneys and stored in the urinary bladder. Urine gets from the kidneys to the urinary bladder via these tubes known as ureters. So we have a right and left ureter. So in this picture, really all we're concerned with are three overall structures: the kidneys, the ureters, and the bladder. Now, if we look here, this is once again another frontal section, just sliced right down from top to bottom. This is the back half of the kidney. The periphery of the kidney, and this is the case with any solid organs in the body, the periphery of the kidney is known as the cortex, specifically the renal cortex. So from here to here is the renal cortex. From here to here is the renal cortex. So all of this represents the renal cortex. And anything interior to that, or towards the middle or medial, if you will, is the renal medulla. So we have the renal cortex and the renal medulla. It is the nephron, which we see here, that is the functional unit of the kidney. The nephron does all the work for the kidney. So when I'm talking about maintenance of pH, excretion of metabolites, reabsorption, filtration, that's all happening within the nephron or by the nephron. And we're going to take another look at this because it's really hard to decipher what's going on in this picture. Here is a better look at the nephron. It's certainly not realistic. That one's more realistic, but we tend to describe it with the nephron spread out like this so we can get a better grasp of it. Once again, from here to here is the renal cortex, and interior right here is the renal medulla. The majority of the nephron is in the cortex, though for some nephrons, the loop of Henle, which is this structure right here, dips into the renal medulla. And then this is the collecting duct, which also dips into the renal medulla. I'm going to go over this in a number of images, but real quick, the nephron has Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and a collecting duct. The collecting duct is shared by a number of different nephrons. So maybe it's not totally accurate to say the collecting duct is part of a nephron because it's shared by a number of nephrons. So for example, we have a distal convoluted tubule entering this nephron right here, but this branch right here would be from another distal convoluted tubule from a nephron over here, and this branch right here would be yet from another distal convoluted tubule of another nephron. So the collecting duct is shared by a number of different nephrons. So in green is the nephron. In pink and in blue right here are blood vessels. The blood vessels are not technically part of the nephron, but they are functionally tied to the nephron. The nephron cannot do its function without these blood vessels, and these blood vessels would be meaningless without the nephron. So I'm just going to describe the nephron first. We'll talk about the blood vessels and the relationship between the two. So the nephron has this first part right here, which is Bowman's capsule. One thing I want to highlight is that this whole green structure, the whole nephron, is one big tube somewhat akin to a blood vessel. It is certainly not a blood vessel, but my analogy is that there's an open space or lumen within this tube that substance passes through. That substance we refer to as filtrate, and we'll look at that in a second here. But keep in mind, everything we're looking at in green is a tube. So the first part of it is Bowman's capsule. That is where filtration occurs. Leaving Bowman's capsule, we have this right here, which is the proximal convoluted tubule that we tend to abbreviate, or I tend to abbreviate, is the PCT. Leaving the proximal convoluted tubule, we have the loop of Henle, which I mentioned earlier, which in a number of nephrons tends to dip into the renal medulla. So that is the loop of Henle. Keep in mind, in this picture, we're moving from left to right. Certainly in our description, we're moving left to right. But the substance within Bowman's capsule, known as filtrate, within this case is moving from left to right, because it always starts in Bowman's capsule, moves through the proximal convoluted tubule, into the loop of Henle, and then it proceeds into the distal convoluted tubule, otherwise known as the DCT. That is the nephron. Once the filtrate leaves the distal convoluted tubule, it's dumping into a collecting duct. Okay? Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. Now, I had mentioned these blood vessels, and these blood vessels are very, very important. The renal system, for whatever reason, has the most challenging words to pronounce, maybe even to spell. And they've been challenging for me. It's taken quite a while to figure out actually how to pronounce these. But this capillary bed embedded within Bowman's capsule that we see right here is known as the glomerulus. The glomerulus is a capillary bed physically and functionally associated with Bowman's capsule. And this is where filtration occurs. Bringing blood into Bowman's capsule is the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole is supplying blood to Bowman's capsule. Now we can think of the heart delivering blood to the systemic circulation via the aorta, and then from there we have branches of arteries that distribute blood through two specific organs and tissues. The renal artery is going to take blood to the kidneys, and eventually that's going to turn into the afferent arteriole, bringing blood to the glomerulus. I certainly skipped a number of smaller arteries and arterioles between the renal artery and the afferent arteriole, but what I just want to be clear is the afferent arteriole is part of the systemic circulation providing blood to Bowman's capsule. Filtration occurs between the interface of the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. Whatever does not get filtered, and not everything gets filtered, whatever doesn't get filtered leaves the glomerulus via the efferent arteriole. So the efferent arteriole, seen right here, is taking blood away from the glomerulus. The afferent arteriole is taking blood to the glomerulus. And then the efferent arteriole will turn into another capillary bed or blood vessel known as the peritubular capillary. Peri means to surround. Tubular is referring to the nephron because, like I suggested earlier, it's one big tube. So this capillary, if we look back at this slide right here, is all of this right here that's just surrounding and covering up the nephron or the tube. In this picture, we can see here, this is a glomerulus. Surrounding it right here is Bowman's capsule. Bringing blood into the glomerulus is the afferent arteriole. But back to our picture here, afferent arteriole bringing blood into this capillary bed known as the glomerulus, efferent arteriole taking blood away, which eventually merges into the peritubular capillary. Now, if we look at this functionally, this is what we have. In green, we still have our nephron, Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. In pink, we have the afferent arteriole, the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole, giving rise to the peritubular capillary. Filtration occurs between the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. Filtration is the movement of products from the blood from the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule. Nearly everything is getting filtered with the exception of blood cells or formed elements and plasma proteins. So that means waste products, hydrogen ion, any of the ions, macromolecules like glucose and fats, and amino acids, certainly some smaller proteins like hormones. That's how we eliminate a number of hormones from our body, and water. So anything in the blood plasma, with the exception of most plasma proteins, are not going to get filtered. But it's not all getting filtered at any given time, because we still need to maintain our blood volume to maintain blood pressure. But I'm going to throw a number out, and we'll talk about this number in more detail. The glomerulus filters 180 liters of blood plasma every single day. Every 24 hours, 180 liters of blood plasma is filtered. And that number should seem huge to you, considering our body only contains about 3 liters of plasma. So we will revisit that. But the interface between this capillary bed and Bowman's capsule is where filtration occurs, and that's where substances leave the bloodstream and enter the nephron, which is a big tube. What I've shown here in burnt orange, I guess, is the substance that has entered the nephron. And once it's in the nephron, it's known as filtrate. So some of that filtrate is certainly going to pass through the whole nephron to the collecting duct. And once it leaves the collecting duct, it becomes excreted. And that is actually what's known as urine when it leaves the collecting duct. It's going to leave the collecting duct, enter the medullary area of the kidney, to the calyces, the renal pelvis, the ureter, onto the urinary bladder. But once it leaves the collecting duct, it's known as urine. The process of leaving the collecting duct is known as excretion. So what I have written here is filtrate that has left the collecting duct, i.e. urine. That is filtration. But not everything that is filtered actually ends up leaving the nephron via the collecting duct. As a matter of fact, about 99% of our filtrate actually never makes it in the form of urine because it is reabsorbed back into our bloodstream. So the filtration at the nephron is an imperfect system because these nephrons, and I should be very clear, there's about 1 million nephrons per kidney. So it's not just one nephron doing this. If there's 2 kidneys, then we have a total of roughly 2 million nephrons doing all of this work. And it's an imperfect system because most of what gets filtered actually gets reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So reabsorption is the movement of filtrate back into the bloodstream. That can happen anywhere along the length of the nephron, though a great majority of it does happen via the proximal convoluted tubule, from the proximal convoluted tubule into the peritubular capillary. So it's called reabsorption because absorption is the initial uptake of nutrients, molecules, ions, vitamins, minerals from our GI tract, generally our small intestine, into our bloodstream. We've absorbed all that material into our blood initially. And once it goes through the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule, it leaves the bloodstream. That is filtration. If the nephron decides that some of that material, a lot of that material, let's say like glucose, needs to be back into our system, back into our bloodstream, it is absorbed again, hence the term reabsorption. Movement from the nephron back into the peritubular capillary. Now, sometimes the filtrate, as it's passing along the collecting duct, our body realizes there's still some things in the blood that need to be eliminated. And this can be confusing. Why did it not get filtered here initially in the Bowman's capsule? I guess the quick, easy answer is just that it didn't. But sometimes things are secreted into the distal convoluted tubule, added to the filtrate. So filtrate or filtration and secretion are moving the same direction. They are both moving products from the bloodstream into the nephron, from the bloodstream into the nephron. So you can see the arrows here from filtration from the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule, and the arrows here from the blood into Bowman's capsule. Both of these are moving from the blood to the nephron, blood to the nephron. They're going the same direction. They're adding to filtrate, whereas reabsorption is taking away from the filtrate. So once again, secretion can happen anywhere along the nephron. I shouldn't say anywhere, between the proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, and distal convoluted tubule. It certainly does not happen at Bowman's capsule. Neither does reabsorption. The only thing that happens at Bowman's capsule is filtration. And for the record, occasionally I will use the term renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is the combination of the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. So both of these together are known as the renal corpuscle. Okay, so we have filtration at Bowman's capsule. We have reabsorption, which is movement from the nephron to the blood. We have secretion from the blood back into the nephron. And then when the filtrate leaves the collecting duct, it becomes urine. So this equation at the top of this slide describes just what we have been talking about. That is to say, excretion equals whatever has been filtered minus whatever has been reabsorbed plus whatever has been secreted. Certainly we could write it filtration plus secretion, which are moving the same direction, minus reabsorption. But this equation allows us to understand what is going to be excreted from the nephrons. Admittedly, the renal system is one of the harder systems in the body to understand. This is the basic anatomy and function of the nephron, and we'll get into details of this in these subsequent videos.